Welcome to a deep dive into AI and ethics. We're going to be looking at Guardians of the Code. It's a book that really digs into how the Biden administration's AI executive order tries to wrangle the ethical challenges of AI, and they use the Seven Directives as a lens.
It's really interesting how the book kind of brings those two things together, because it's not just some like dry policy document. This is about how AI could totally change like every industry, but also all the risks that come with that.
Right. So let's talk about this executive order. What's the main takeaway? Is it just an America first when it comes to AI or what?
It's definitely not just about winning at all costs. The executive order says, AI has this crazy potential for good, but it could also be really harmful. And it says that the U.S. needs to be a leader in AI.
Yeah.
But not by like throwing ethics out the window.
So it's like we want to be number one, but responsibly.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's where this whole multi-stakeholder approach comes in. The government knows it can't do this alone. They're saying, hey, we need to work with the private sector, researchers, everyone really, to make sure AI benefits everybody.
So with great AI power comes great responsibility, and we all got to share it.
That's interesting. And this idea of working together, that goes international too, right?
Definitely. Section 1 of the order actually talks about how important international collaboration is. Think about it. AI doesn't care about borders. A rogue AI in one country could be everyone's problem.
It's like a digital pandemic just waiting to happen.
That's a great way to put it. Data flows around the world, algorithms, has to be a global thing.
It really makes you think about how connected we all are in this digital age. Okay, so Section 1 sets the stage, but when does the executive order get into the details? Section 2A is where the rubber meets the road. It gets into the nitty-gritty of making sure AI is safe and secure. We're talking identifying risks, having plans to reduce them, and then constantly watching AI systems. It even says you have to do something called red teaming tests, which are basically like ethical hacking, but for AI.
So it's like putting your AI through boot camp before you unleash it on the world. How does that even work?
Basically, you get a group of experts, and their job is to try and break your AI system to find the weaknesses before they become real-world problems. It's like a really tough stress test to make sure the AI is as safe and as secure as possible, especially in important areas like biotechnology or national security.
That makes sense. I would not want to be anywhere near an AI that's controlling important stuff if it hasn't been red teamed.
Right. And another important thing the executive order wants is what they call effective labeling and content provenance mechanisms. Basically, it means you know where your information is coming from and if it can be trusted. With all the deepfakes and AI-generated stuff going around, that's super important for trusting AI.
So in this world where seeing isn't believing anymore, this is about making sure that AI itself is using information that's trustworthy.
Exactly. It's about being open and accountable about where the information comes from, like a supply chain, but for information.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It's not just about the information, though, right? We have to think about how AI could make existing inequalities worse. Does the executive order deal with that?
It does. Section 2 is all about that. It's about fairness and making sure AI isn't used to discriminate against certain groups. It says you can't use AI to discriminate based on things like race, religion, gender, or sexual orientation.
Well, that's good to hear, because AI is being used for things like hiring or getting a loan, even in the criminal justice system, and bias in those situations could have huge consequences.
Absolutely. Just imagine some AI hiring system that was trained on data that's already biased. It would just keep those biases going and could even screen out qualified candidates from certain backgrounds without even realizing it. This part of the order is trying to prevent that.
It's like that saying, garbage in, garbage out, but with really serious consequences.
Exactly. And it's not just about preventing harm. The order also talks about creating opportunities. It wants things like investing in AI education and training, especially in underserved communities, or encouraging more diversity in the people who work in AI.
So if we want AI to help everyone, we need to make sure everyone has a chance to be a part of developing it and using it. That makes sense.
Right. And this section brings up an important but kind of scary question. How are we supposed to define and deal with new forms of harm that AI might create in the workplace?
Whoa. That's a little unsettling. It's like we're trying to hit a moving target.
It is. AI is changing so fast that it's probably going to create problems that we haven't even thought of yet. We can't just rely on what we know about discrimination now.
It's like we're building the plane as we're flying it, but with ethics.
That's a great way to put it. We need to be proactive and always be reevaluating these ethical frameworks to keep up with the technology.
And on that slightly ominous note, let's change gears for a second and talk about Directive 5. This is where things get really interesting really quickly. This isn't just about algorithms with biases. This is about AI that could actually threaten people's lives and dignity.
Yeah, this is where that guardians of the code idea really comes into play. This directive is all about recognizing that AI could become our enemy. And the book doesn't shy away from that. It talks about things like using facial recognition technology as a weapon and the development of autonomous weapons.
Okay, that sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie. Give me a real-world scenario where AI is being used in a way that could be seen as a threat.
Imagine AI-powered surveillance systems used by, authoritarian governments to keep track of people and shut down any kind of political disagreement. This is happening right now, and it really shows you how dangerous AI could be in the wrong hands.
That's chilling. Like Big Brother, but way worse. So what can we do about it? What solutions does the book offer?
The book says we need a multi-pronged approach. Things to prevent these issues, like ethical review boards, making algorithms transparent, and, you guessed it, international cooperation to reduce these risks. It's about building in safeguards at every level, from when it's being developed all the way to when it's actually being used.
So we need to make sure that at every step of the way, someone is responsible for making sure AI is used ethically. But who's ultimately responsible? Is it the developers? The government?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that people argue about a lot. The book says that it's not just on one group. Governments, the people making policy, developers, and even everyday people have a responsibility. We all have a role to play in making sure AI is used for good.
So it's like we're all responsible for making sure AI doesn't turn into some kind of dystopian nightmare. And speaking of shared responsibility, that takes us to Section 2 of the executive order. This is where the U.S. talks about being a world leader in AI, right?
Yeah, and this section is all about using that leadership to encourage responsible AI development around the world. It emphasizes how important it is to protect human life and dignity.
But does it say how to actually achieve this global, ethical AI leadership, or is it more of an aspiration?
That's the million-dollar question. The executive order has good intentions, but it's a little vague on the specifics here, and that's where Guardians of the Code challenges us to really think critically.
It's one thing to say you want to be an ethical leader, but it's another thing entirely to actually do it.
For sure. It's going to take a ton of collaboration, a lot of diplomacy, and a lot of tough conversations, both here in the U.S. and with other countries.
It sounds like Guardians of the Code is saying that these conversations are crucial if we want to avoid a future where AI does more harm than good.
Exactly. And a good starting point for these conversations is transparency, which is what Section 2B is all about.
And this brings us full circle, back to transparency and accountability in AI.
Precisely. It's about being able to understand how AI is making decisions and having ways for the public to keep an eye on things. The book actually gives some real-world examples of companies that are doing a good job with this, like Path AI and DeepMind in the healthcare AI field.
What are they doing specifically? What are the key takeaways?
Well, they're doing things like using what they call interpretable algorithms, so you can understand how the AI is coming to its decisions. They're also setting up independent groups to examine the ethical implications of their work.
So it's not just about building AI that works, it's about building AI that we can understand and trust.
You got it. And I think that's what this part of the executive order and the whole book really is trying to emphasize. Transparency isn't just a bonus. It's fundamental for making sure AI is used ethically. After all, how can you say you're controlling something you don't even understand?
It's like trying to do a puzzle when you're missing some of the pieces. You might get close, but you're never going to get the full picture.
Exactly. And with AI, we need the full picture. We need to understand not just what these technologies are, but how and why they work.
So we've talked about safety, security, fairness, global leadership, and transparency. But what about the 7 directives themselves? How do those principles fit into all of this?
Yeah, so the 7 directives, they're like an ethical compass for developing AI. They lay out these core principles, and the most important one is definitely protecting human life and dignity. Making sure those are always a priority.
So they're like the guiding principles, the North Star for ethical AI, would you say?
Totally. And it's interesting how much the executive order actually lines up with these directives, especially that first one. It's almost like they had those ethical principles in mind when they were writing it.
So it's not just about checking boxes, but showing a real commitment to these values.
Exactly. And you see this throughout the order, like all that emphasis on transparency and accountability that we keep coming back to, that's directly related to this ethical idea that AI has to be used responsibly, and that we need ways to prevent harm.
So it's like they're saying, look, we're not just going to develop AI just because we can. It has to be done in a way that respects human values.
Right, and that's huge because AI is so powerful, right? We need these strong ethical frameworks, and those 7 directives, working together with the executive order, they provide a pretty solid foundation for that.
And Guardians of the Code doesn't just lay out these ideals. It also gets into some real-world examples of where AI has actually gone wrong, where it's become a problem. Can you walk us through a couple of those?
Yeah, the book talks about a few kind of scary examples. One is the use of AI in what they call predictive policing. The idea is to use AI to try to predict where crime might happen, but the system can end up making existing biases even worse.
So instead of actually stopping crime, it might end up unfairly targeting certain communities.
Exactly. And that goes completely against the 5th directive, which basically says that any intelligence that goes against these ethical guidelines is an enemy.
So in that example, the AI system itself is considered the threat.
Exactly. The book gives another example in healthcare, where an AI system that was supposed to come up with the best treatment plans for patients was actually found to be biased.
Really? That seems like it should be helpful, though.
Well, yeah, the idea was good, but it was recommending more aggressive treatments for minority patients compared to others, even when their medical situations were pretty similar.
That's really unsettling. It just goes to show that even in something like healthcare, which seems so positive, AI can still make existing biases worse if we're not really careful about how it's developed and used.
For sure. This case shows how important it is to have ethical oversight, to have systems in place that make sure AI systems are fair and unbiased. If we don't, it can make inequalities worse and even create new types of harm.
And that brings us right back to transparency and accountability, right? If we don't understand how these systems are making decisions, how can we be sure they're not discriminating against certain groups?
Right. Transparency is essential, and so is continuous monitoring. We can't just assume that once an AI system is up and running, it's going to be fair forever. We need to be constantly checking how it's performing and making sure it's not continuing to use those harmful biases.
So trust but verify, right? And with something as powerful as AI, verification is critical.
Absolutely. That's really where Guardians of the Code is so helpful. It's not just theoretical. It's full of real-world examples and useful insights that we can use to actually govern AI ethically.
And the book also goes into a really tricky issue, using AI in national security. Ethically, it seems like a minefield, but the consequences are huge. What are some of the key takeaways from the book's analysis of this?
Yeah. The book acknowledges this really difficult balancing act we have to do with AI and national security. On the one hand, AI could really improve our national security. Think about intelligence gathering, cybersecurity, that sort of thing. But on the other hand, there's a real risk it could be used in ways that go against human rights or even make international conflicts worse.
It's a classic double-edged sword situation.
For sure. And the book's argument is that to deal with this complexity, we have to make sure that really strong ethical principles are guiding how we develop and use AI in national security.
Which, like we've been talking about, is a lot easier said than done. How do you even define ethical principles when you're dealing with something as complicated as national security, where national interests are often at stake?
That's the question, isn't it? Guardians of the Code says that those 7 directives, particularly the focus on protecting human life and dignity, those are a good starting point for ethical AI, even when it comes to national security.
So even when we're talking about national security, those core ethical principles should still be the priority.
Absolutely. And the book explores some suggestions for making sure that actually happens. One is creating really clear guidelines and oversight mechanisms for how AI is developed and used in national security contexts.
What would those look like in practice? Can you give me an example?
Sure. Think about having independent review boards that can evaluate the ethical implications of new AI technologies, or having clear rules of engagement for when and how we use AI-powered weapon systems.
So basically putting in place safeguards so that AI isn't used to hurt civilians or violate international law.
Exactly. The book also emphasizes how important transparency is, even when it comes to national security, which can be tricky. That might mean making the algorithms that AI systems use easier to understand, or maybe even providing public reports on how AI is being used in military operations.
I can imagine that transparency in national security is a tough sell, but it sounds like the book is saying it's absolutely necessary, even in that context.
Yeah, it is. Because without transparency, you can't have accountability.
Right.
And without accountability, there's a big risk that AI will be used in ways that are both harmful and unethical.
It's that balance again, right? National security versus human rights.
It is. But Guardians of the Code makes the case that AI, if it's done right, can actually support both. It can make us safer while also protecting human rights.
Didn't have to be either. We can find ways to use AI to achieve both goals.
Exactly. And the book also brings up a really important point. We need countries to work together when it comes to AI governance, especially in the context of national security.
That makes sense. If one country is developing AI in a way that other countries think is unethical or even dangerous, that's asking for trouble.
For sure. And the book suggests the best way to prevent that is for countries to work together through international agreements and collaborations to come up with global norms and standards for ethical AI development.
So everyone gets on the same page, agreeing on a set of ethical principles that everyone can support.
Exactly. It's a huge challenge. But the book argues that it's one we absolutely have to tackle head on. The future of AI, maybe even humanity, depends on it.
That's a sobering thought. Now, one thing that comes up throughout the book is this idea of AI being a dual-use technology. What does that actually mean, and why is it so important when we're talking about ethical AI?
That's a great point. Dual use basically means that the same technology can be used for good things or for bad things. A good example is nuclear technology. It can be used to generate clean energy, or it can be used to build weapons of mass destruction.
So would you say AI falls into that category?
Definitely. AI can help us do amazing things like diagnose diseases and develop new life-saving treatments, but it can also be used to create autonomous weapons or really powerful surveillance systems that could be used to oppress people.
So the same technology that could help us cure cancer could also be used to create a killer robot.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial to have strong ethical frameworks guiding how we develop and use AI. We have to be really clear-eyed about the potential risks, even as we're excited about the potential benefits.
So it's about finding a balance, being cautiously optimistic. We can recognize that amazing things are possible while also being aware of the potential dangers.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. The book says that this idea of dual use has to be front and center when we think about AI governance. We can't just focus on the good stuff. We have to approach this carefully and responsibly, understanding that AI is a really powerful tool that can be used in very different ways.
It's about being proactive, isn't it? Thinking about the potential problems before they happen and putting safeguards in place.
You got it. And that's another strength of Guardians of the Code. It doesn't just point out the problems. It actually offers solutions. It gives us a potential roadmap for ethical AI governance that's grounded in principles, but also in what's actually doable.
Speaking of what's doable, one of the biggest challenges with governing AI is just how fast the technology is developing. How can we make sure our ethical frameworks can keep up with these rapid changes?
That is a key question. And the book acknowledges that it's one of the biggest hurdles we face. AI is constantly changing, pushing the boundaries of what we thought was possible. So how do you design ethical frameworks that are both robust and flexible enough to adapt?
Right. It's like trying to hit a moving target. We can't just create these ethical guidelines and assume they'll be relevant forever.
Exactly. We need a more dynamic approach. And the book offers a couple really important insights here. First, it says that we need to be constantly reviewing and adapting our ethical frameworks.
So it's not a one and done thing. We can't just create the guidelines and then wash our hands of it. We have to constantly reevaluate them as technology changes and be willing to make adjustments.
Exactly. It's a continuous process. The book also says that we need a lot of different people involved in this. We can't just leave decisions about AI ethics to the technologists or the policymakers. We need to include ethicists, social scientists, industry leaders, and the public to make sure these ethical frameworks are comprehensive and truly representative.
So we need to get everyone's perspective right because AI is going to affect everyone.
Absolutely. And that impact extends to the workforce, too, which is another key topic the book explores. AI has the potential to automate a lot of jobs. And that's making a lot of people nervous, which makes sense.
It's not just some far-off threat either. It's happening right now, and it feels like it's only going to get bigger. How does the book address that?
Guardians of the Code acknowledges that when AI starts automating jobs, it could really disrupt the labor market. Some jobs are probably going to be automated, which could lead to people losing their jobs and an increase in economic inequality.
So we're not just talking about a technology problem, we're talking about a societal problem.
Exactly. And the book's point is that we need to get ahead of this. We can't just wait for the robots to take over and then try to figure things out.
So what does it recommend? What steps can we take to prepare for these potential disruptions?
The book has a few suggestions. One is to really invest in education and training programs so that workers have the skills they need to adapt to the changing job market. It also suggests policies like unemployment benefits or retraining programs to help workers who do end up losing their jobs because of AI.
So it's about giving people the tools they need to succeed in a world where AI is playing a bigger and bigger role in the economy and making sure there's a safety net for those who are most affected by these changes.
Right. And the book stresses the importance of having a bigger societal conversation about what the future of work looks like in this new AI-powered world. What kind of world do we want? What role do we want AI to play in our lives?
Those are big questions.
They are, but they're questions we need to be asking right now because the future is coming, whether we're ready for it or not.
And speaking of the future, the book ends with a really thought-provoking question. What is that question, and why do we need to think about it?
The question is, as AI rapidly advances, how can we ensure that its development and deployment remain firmly rooted in ethical principles that prioritize human well-being above all else?
Wow, that really is the million-dollar question, isn't it? It feels relevant to the entire field of AI.
It really is. And there isn't one simple answer. But it's something we all need to be grappling with. The decisions we make now, the ethical frameworks we establish, those are going to have a huge impact on the future of AI and on humanity itself.
It's like we're at a fork in the road, and the path we choose now is going to determine the course of history.
That's a powerful way to put it. And I think Guardians of the Code does a really great job of highlighting how important it is to make the right choices. It's like a call to action, pushing us to be thoughtful, but also optimistic as we navigate the development of AI.
So it's about finding that balance, being cautious so that we don't accidentally create something that harms us, but also being optimistic about AI's potential to solve some of the world's biggest problems.
Exactly. And I think the book leaves us with a sense of hope. If we work together, if we prioritize these ethical considerations, we can actually make AI a force for good. It's not going to be easy, but it's a challenge worth tackling.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground. But there's always more to discuss when it comes to AI and ethics.
Oh, absolutely. And Guardians of the Code goes beyond just asking those big questions. It really stresses this idea of like building a culture where everyone feels responsible for ethical AI. And it's not just on the programmers or the people making the laws, it's on everyone.
So you're saying we can't just count on the people writing the code or making the rules to figure out the ethics of all this?
Yeah, exactly. It's not enough to just have some rules and regulations, like a checklist. We need everyone in society to understand what's at stake ethically with AI.
Because in the end, we're all going to be living in a world that's more and more shaped by AI, even if we don't know a thing about coding.
Exactly. The book says that we all have a responsibility to stay informed, to really think critically about AI, and to hold the people who are developing and using it accountable to those ethical standards we've been talking about.
So it's about being an active and engaged citizen in this new AI-powered world, right?
Yeah.
We can't just accept every new piece of technology that comes along. We have to understand what it means for us, both individually and as a society.
Absolutely. It's about getting why those rules are there, the ethical principles behind them, and being willing to raise your voice, to say something if you see those principles being ignored.
So if we see an AI system that seems to be biased, or if a company is building AI in a way that feels wrong, we shouldn't just stay silent.
Exactly. Staying silent is almost like saying it's okay.
Yeah.
We can't just assume that someone else will take care of the ethical side of things. It's on all of us.
That makes me think about the book's title, Guardians of the Code. It's not just a cool title, is it? It's like a call to action. It's saying that we all have to be guardians of those ethical principles that should be guiding AI development.
That's a great way to put it. And I think Guardians of the Code actually gives us a blueprint for how to be those guardians. It arms us with information, with tools, even with a bit of inspiration to try to shape the future of AI so it benefits everyone. So as we're wrapping up this deep dive, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
I would say this. AI is incredibly powerful. It can help us in extraordinary ways, but it could also really harm us. The important thing is that the future of AI isn't set in stone. We still have a chance to shape it to make sure AI is used in a way that reflects our values and that prioritizes the well-being of humanity.
It's a challenge, absolutely, but it's also an incredible opportunity to create a future where AI works for us, not against us. Totally. And I think Guardians of the Code gives us a reason to be optimistic. If we approach AI thoughtfully, with imagination, and with those ethical principles in mind, if we can work together, we can make AI a force for good in the world.
Well said. And on that hopeful note, we'll leave you with the same question that Guardians of the Code ends with. As AI rapidly advances, how can we ensure that its development and deployment remain firmly rooted in ethical principles that prioritize human well-being above all else?
It's a question worth pondering, and one that every one of us has a role in answering.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious.